Hey everyone, I'm CP, and welcome to another Our Realm video essay. So the other day I was looking through the comment section of a YouTube video, and the new game Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice was being talked about. Really quick, and without naming names, let me show you this one comment I saw that really stuck out to me.
Hellblade is a linear, generic piece of that you'll forget about a week from now.
Holy keyboard warrior, that dude really likes his all caps button. But notice how he specifically mentions that the game is linear, and then condemns it as generic. Now, I'm not even going to waste my time explaining how a game with a female Celtic warrior protagonist with schizophrenia who travels to a Nordic version of hell and also simulates psychosis using 3D sound effects to make it feel like you have voices in your head and uses this as a main staple of the gameplay is not generic, but it does bring up an interesting topic. That being, what exactly is wrong with linear games? That style of progression has been around since video games started telling stories, but now for some reason it's seen as a negative aspect of a game by a lot of people. Some gamers won't even consider playing a game with linear progression. And I'm just sitting here like, bro, you'd rather play this over this because it's not linear? Well, I say there's a very good case to be made in favor of linear games. So with that in mind, today I am speaking in defense of linear games. In order to make a case for linear games at their best, we first need to understand what they look like at their worst. And I can't think of a better recent title to look at for this than The Order 1886. Man, I wanted that game to be fun. Here's a game that tries so hard to focus on the story it's telling and the characters it's portraying that it forgets it's a video game. The gameplay seriously boils down to walk here to watch the story, tap X to start the cutscene, press A to not give a crap, so on and so on. There's really not a lot I can say about this game that hasn't been said to death already, but you get the picture. It's basically the epitome of what the naysayers think of when they hear the term linear video game. A straightforward, minimalistic flatline that focuses more on stylization than it does on actual gameplay. Now, just for the sake of comparison, let's look at No Man's Sky, an example about as far away from linear games as you can possibly get, and yet, it and The Order 1886 have some pretty big things in common. First off, they were both huge disappointments when they came out, both had hype behind them, both looked pretty decent up till release, and both dropped the ball hard. Two games that are basically the opposite of each other in terms of genre and progression style, yet they can both be called disappointments. I bring this up to make my first point. That being, linear games are no more inherently underwhelming than open world games or anything in between. So why didn't these games work out in the end? Both have their merits, certainly, and I personally think that both had care and effort put into them. No Man's Sky is a huge game that takes advantage of procedural generation in a fascinating and even inspiring sort of way. The Order 1886 is beautiful to look at and clearly had some thought put into the story. So what's missing? In my opinion, they're both lacking the opposite thing from one another. I believe that video games as an art form are best described as story through interaction. The Order 1886 has all of the story, but not a lot of interaction. No Man's Sky has plenty of interaction, but there's not enough context to make that interaction mean anything, and neither have enough variation in what they're doing to make it feel like an experience. I say all of this to make my second point. If video games are about story through interaction, then a progression style must be utilized to that end. And so that means that linear progression, when done right, can be used to make a game feel like a full experience, and there are lots of games that do it well. But by the same token, when a non-linear game does its progression style wrong, it can feel just as empty, just as bland, and just as low effort as the bad reputation of linear titles. So that brings us to Hellblade, one of my favorite new titles of the year. Here's a game that knows where to put its focus. The graphics are gorgeous, though not always the most realistic. The combat is fun and tight, but it's also minimalistic and uncomplicated. And yes, you do spend a lot of time walking forward to get from point A to point B, but the way it's laid out gives you a sense of depth to the world it takes place in. All of the elements are evenly balanced with each other. Just enough solid gameplay to make it feel like you're doing something, just enough story and character development to make it feel like that thing you're doing matters, and an art style that lends itself to the world and the atmosphere first, and looks realistic second. This is one of the main advantages of linear games. Strength in simplicity. Where a large open world RPG needs to incorporate as many tiny details as it possibly can and get them down to the wire to make it feel real, a linear game gets its realism from what it doesn't show. The player is left to fill in the blanks, and that can make for some heavy emotion. Now, like any game, it needs to have real effort and vision put into it. Otherwise, you end up with something like Rise, Son of Rome, or Assassin's Creed, Unity, or basically all of the Call of Duty games past Modern Warfare 2. You get the point. So, real talk for a moment. I know that a linear game isn't going to be for everyone, and at the end of the day, it comes down to personal preference what you choose to play. Obviously, that is perfectly fine. You're going to like what you're going to like, but if you dismiss a game entirely based off of its progression style, that's sort of like dismissing a movie based off of its genre. A game's value doesn't equate to the way in which you get through the game. A linear title isn't necessarily worth less than a bigger game, or vice versa. It all comes down to what the game is doing with the structure it's given, and how certain elements come together that determine if said game is a letdown or a masterpiece. Just remember that no matter what kinds of games you prefer to play, both a letdown and a masterpiece can be found just about anywhere. So, keep your eyes open, stay open-minded, and maybe play something a little different every now and again. This is of course just one perspective, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments. Tell us what you think of linear games. Are they great? Do they suck? And what are your thoughts on Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice? Let us know down in the comments below, and expect a new video up next week. Until then, I'm CP, and we'll see you next time on Our Realm.